I'm divorcing Joe.
Before you judge him, explain these accounts.
Yeah!
This signature isn't his, so who used it?
Joe Ramirez was 39, a structural engineer whose name rarely stood out in a room full of executives. Most guests at the Whitmore family birthday gala believed he was an ordinary husband living in the shadow of his wife's wealthy family. He drove an aging pickup, wore a modest navy suit, and quietly helped the hotel staff carry gift boxes before dinner began. What they didn't know was that Joe had spent months preparing for the exact moment everyone thought would break him. Then Gabriela Whitmore Ramirez raised her champagne glass, smiled at nearly 100 guests, and calmly announced, "I'm divorcing Joe." Every conversation stopped as 100 pairs of eyes locked onto the man who never moved. If you're watching from somewhere in the world, leave a comment telling us your country and your local time. I always enjoy seeing where these stories reach. And if you love thoughtful stories filled with unexpected twists and satisfying justice, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss tomorrow's new story. The Whitmore family had spent 3 decades building a name that carried weight across central Ohio. In Columbus, people recognized the Whitmore name long before they recognized the faces behind it. Their company, Whitmore Commercial Holdings, had financed shopping centers, office buildings, medical plazas, and apartment communities stretching from Dublin to Westerville. Their donations appeared on hospital wings, university scholarships, and children's museums. Every December, local television stations covered the Whitmore Foundation's Holiday Charity Gala. To most people, they represented success earned through intelligence and discipline. Very few outsiders ever questioned that image. Joe Ramirez had. Not because he believed the family was dishonest, because he understood something most people ignored. Every successful family eventually became trapped by its own reputation. The birthday celebration was being held inside the Lakeside Country Club, one of the oldest private clubs in Columbus. Crystal chandeliers reflected warm light across polished marble floors, while a jazz quartet played near oversized windows overlooking the golf course. Nearly 100 guests filled the ballroom. Developers, attorneys, bank executives, city officials, corporate consultants. Every table carried fresh white orchids and silver candle holders engraved with Evelyn Whitmore's initials. Joe stood near the back of the room, not hiding, simply standing where he always felt comfortable. He loosened the cuff of his navy jacket after helping one of the hotel employees wheel another cart of gifts toward the stage. The young employee thanked him twice before realizing he was one of the invited guests. Joe simply smiled. "No problem." The employee looked surprised. Most guests had spent the evening giving instructions. Joe had quietly started lifting boxes. That was who he had always been. At 39, Joe had worked for Midwest Structural Group for nearly 13 years. His days usually began before sunrise. He preferred construction sites over conference rooms. He trusted calculations more than promises. Steel beams never lied. Concrete either met specifications or it didn't. People were more complicated. He drove the same gray Ford F-150 he had owned for 6 years. Its paint had faded beneath countless Ohio winters, but the truck ran perfectly because Joe never neglected maintenance. His wristwatch wasn't expensive. His shoes had been polished that morning. His wedding ring showed scratches collected over years of inspecting bridges, warehouses, and parking structures. Nothing about him attracted attention, and that suited him perfectly. Across the ballroom, Gabriela Whitmore Ramirez stood surrounded by friends wearing a tailored emerald evening gown that seemed designed for magazine covers. She belonged in rooms like this. She knew exactly which executive deserved another minute of conversation, exactly which investor appreciated compliments, exactly when photographers might capture another perfect smile. Years earlier, Joe had admired that confidence. Now he mostly observed it. The applause following her divorce announcement had disappeared. Silence had replaced it. People shifted in their seats, unsure whether they were witnessing an awkward family dispute or the beginning of something much larger. Joe noticed details others overlooked. One waiter had stopped pouring wine halfway through a glass. Someone near the orchestra quietly lowered a violin. A woman seated beside the dance floor removed her reading glasses, as though she suddenly needed a clearer view. Nobody looked toward the birthday cake anymore. Everyone watched Joe. Most expected anger. Others expected begging. Some probably hoped for a dramatic argument worthy of tomorrow's gossip. Joe gave them none. His breathing remained steady. His shoulders never tightened. His eyes settled briefly on Gabriella before moving slowly across the room. The years had taught him that silence often revealed more than words. Long before he married Gabriella, Joe had grown up on the west side of Columbus. His father, Miguel Ramirez, repaired commercial HVAC systems. His mother, Elena Ramirez, spent nearly 25 years working overnight shifts as a hospital laboratory technician. Money had always been carefully measured. Vacations were rare. Nothing inside their modest home had been purchased on impulse. Joe learned early that if something broke, you fixed it before buying another. His parents never spoke about sacrifice. They simply lived it. School became Joe's escape. Mathematics felt honest. Physics rewarded patience. When other students complained about homework, Joe stayed after class asking questions about bridge design and load distribution. Scholarships eventually carried him through Ohio State University. He graduated near the top of his engineering class without owing $1 in student loans. Everything he owned afterward came one paycheck at a time. No inheritance, no connections, no shortcuts. Gabriella entered his life almost 11 years earlier. They met during a downtown redevelopment project. Joe was reviewing structural plans for a historic warehouse renovation. Gabriella represented Whitmore Commercial Holdings. She possessed energy that filled every room. She challenged architects, negotiated aggressively, solved problems quickly. Joe admired how fearless she seemed. Gabriella once admitted she admired Joe because he never exaggerated anything. "If you tell me a building is safe," she had laughed one afternoon, "I actually believe you." Back then, she meant it. Their relationship grew slowly. Weekend coffee, baseball games, long walks through German Village. Neither cared much about expensive restaurants. Those early years had felt uncomplicated. William Whitmore noticed something different about Joe before anyone else did. Unlike many young professionals eager to impress wealthy clients, Joe never treated William differently because of his reputation. He shook his hand firmly, answered questions honestly, never pretended to know more than he did. William respected that. When Joe asked for permission to marry Gabriella, William's answer came after only a few seconds. "Take care of each other." Joe had promised he would. He meant every word. The first cracks appeared after Gabriella became executive vice president inside the family company. Success changed the conversations around her. Promotions brought larger offices, luxury vacations, exclusive business circles. Increasingly, Joe became the quiet husband standing beside someone everyone wanted to meet. Small remarks accumulated over time. An uncle joked that engineers always worked for developers. A cousin laughed about Joe's pickup truck parked outside luxury hotels. Someone once asked whether Gabriella planned to upgrade husbands after becoming CEO someday. Joe never answered. Gabriella rarely corrected them. She usually smiled politely before changing the subject. Each individual moment seemed harmless. Together, they formed something heavier. Family dinners became strangely predictable. Discussions revolved around acquisitions, private equity, commercial lending, luxury developments. Joe contributed only when someone genuinely asked about engineering. Most never did. He noticed William occasionally watching these interactions. The retired judge rarely interrupted, but his expression revealed quiet disappointment whenever Joe's opinions were dismissed. William understood respect. He had spent decades inside federal courtrooms where listening mattered more than speaking. Across the ballroom, Evelyn Whitmore still sat at the head table. Her birthday smile slowly fading into confusion. This celebration no longer belonged to her. Gabriella remained standing with perfect posture, as though she had rehearsed every sentence she intended to say. Joe watched her carefully, not with anger, with curiosity. Something felt rehearsed. Not merely the divorce announcement, everything. The timing, the audience, even where she had chosen to stand. Joe slowly turned his attention toward William. The retired judge wasn't looking at his daughter anymore. His eyes rested on a leather portfolio lying beside his chair. Then William placed one hand on it, drew a slow breath, and looked directly at Joe. For the first time that evening, Joe realized they were both waiting for exactly the same moment. No one moved. Even the jazz quartet remained frozen, their instruments resting silently in their hands. Gabriella stood at the center of the ballroom, still holding her champagne flute, with effortless confidence. The spotlight above the dance floor reflected against the crystal in her hand, sending small flashes of light across the ceiling. She looked exactly like someone delivering a carefully rehearsed presentation instead of ending a marriage. Joe remained where he was. His hands rested naturally at his sides. He neither lowered his head nor searched for sympathy among the guests. The silence stretched long enough for people to become uncomfortable. Gabriella finally spoke again. "I know this may come as a surprise to some of you." Her voice carried smoothly across the ballroom. "But I've spent years pretending everything was fine." Several women near the front table exchanged sympathetic looks. Joe noticed them. Not because he cared what they thought, because he had spent years learning how quickly people formed opinions before hearing both sides. Gabriella slowly walked toward the center of the room. "I've worked 12-hour days building Whitmore Commercial Holdings, while Joe—" She paused deliberately. "Has been satisfied doing just enough." A few uncomfortable laughs came from the back of the room. Joe recognized one of the men laughing. Thomas Grayson, a commercial lender who had attended countless Whitmore charity events. Thomas had met Joe 3 times. He had never once asked what Joe actually did for a living. Gabriella continued. "Everyone thinks Joe is quiet because he's humble." She smiled. "The truth is much simpler." She took another sip of champagne. "He has no ambition." Someone quietly whispered, "I knew it." Joe heard the comment but never looked toward the voice. His attention remained on Gabriella. She was speaking with remarkable precision. Every sentence was short. Every pause felt intentional. She wanted the audience on her side before Joe ever had the opportunity to respond. It was an effective strategy, especially in a room filled with people who respected appearances. "I've spent years carrying this marriage," Gabriella continued. "I introduced Joe to business leaders. I opened doors. I brought opportunities. But eventually I realized." She slowly shook her head. "You can't build a future with someone who refuses to grow." Several guests nodded. Joe noticed Evelyn Whitmore lowering her eyes toward the tablecloth. The birthday cake remained untouched. Its 65 candles had never been lit. Tonight had stopped being about birthdays. It had become something entirely different. Joe glanced toward one of the hotel servers standing beside the entrance. The young man shifted his weight nervously while gripping a tray filled with untouched champagne glasses. Nobody wanted another drink anymore. They wanted answers. Gabriella looked directly at Joe. "Would you like to deny any of this?" Her voice remained calm, almost generous, as though she were giving him one final opportunity. Every eye returned to Joe. He considered her question, not because he needed time to think, because he understood the value of silence. Silence forced people to reveal themselves. Silence made impatient people uncomfortable. Silence often caused someone else to speak first. Joe simply answered, "No." Several people looked confused. Gabriella blinked once. "You don't deny it?" Joe met her eyes. "I don't deny that you believe what you're saying." A murmur spread through the ballroom. It wasn't an accusation, it wasn't even a defense, it was simply a statement. Gabriella immediately continued before anyone could process it. "See?" She turned towards the guests. "He won't even defend himself." Someone from another table quietly muttered, "That's basically admitting it." Joe heard those words too. He let them pass, because none of this surprised him. He had imagined this evening many different ways over the previous 4 months. Public humiliation had always remained one possibility. He simply hadn't expected it to happen during Evelyn's birthday. As Gabriella continued speaking, Joe's attention drifted not away from her, but toward memories that refused to leave him. 4 months earlier, he had been reviewing engineering revisions for a mixed-use commercial development north of downtown Columbus. Nothing unusual, until page 47. His digital approval appeared beneath a structural modification he had never reviewed. The electronic signature looked perfect. His employee identification number was correct. The approval timestamp matched company formatting. Only one detail bothered him. Joe remembered spending that afternoon inspecting a parking garage in Cincinnati. He had never even opened the file. At first, he assumed it was a software error. Then another document appeared. Then another. Small discrepancies. Tiny inconsistencies. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to make an experienced engineer uncomfortable. He reported the issue through internal channels. No one found anything. Eventually, he stopped mentioning it. Not because he lost interest, because he had decided to investigate quietly. Back inside the ballroom, Gabriella's voice interrupted his thoughts. "You've hidden behind your silence for years." She looked toward her parents. "I've tried to save this marriage." Evelyn slowly nodded. William did not. Joe noticed that immediately. The retired judge hadn't moved since Gabriella began speaking. His face remained unreadable. Years spent inside federal courtrooms had trained him not to react before evidence appeared. Joe admired that quality. It reminded him of structural inspections. You never reached conclusions before examining every beam. Gabriella continued. "I deserve someone who shares my vision." Someone near the dance floor applauded softly. Others joined. The applause remained weak, forced, uncertain. Joe observed another detail. William still hadn't clapped. Neither had 3 attorneys seated beside him. Interesting. Joe looked toward William's leather portfolio again. Still closed. Still resting beside his chair. Still untouched. William's right hand remained gently placed across it, as though reminding himself why he had brought it. Gabriella turned back toward Joe. "I've already filed the divorce petition." Another ripple passed through the room. "I've asked for a fair division of our assets." Joe nodded once. "I assumed you had." His answer surprised several guests. No anger, no questions, no panic. Gabriella frowned almost imperceptibly. She had expected resistance. Instead, she found calm. Joe wasn't acting. His attorney had already informed him nearly 2 weeks earlier that preliminary divorce paperwork had been quietly prepared. He had expected service sooner or later. Just not here. Not tonight. Gabriella took one careful step closer. "You don't seem surprised." Joe answered honestly. "I'm not." The room became quiet again. Someone cleared his throat. A chair scraped softly against the hardwood floor. Outside the ballroom windows, summer rain had begun falling across the golf course. The sound barely reached inside. Joe noticed everything. Rain usually calmed him. Construction schedules depended on weather. Engineers learned patience because nature refused to follow deadlines. His father had once told him something during a roofing repair when Joe was 14. "The loudest hammer isn't always the one driving the nail." He had never forgotten it. Gabriella finally sighed. "I think that tells everyone everything they need to know." Before anyone else could respond, a chair moved. Not loudly. Just enough. William Whitmore stood. At 71, the retired federal judge no longer possessed the commanding voice he had used during decades on the bench. He no longer needed it. Authority had become part of the way he carried himself. Every conversation in the ballroom stopped. William adjusted his jacket, looked first at Evelyn, then at Joe. finally at Gabriella. His expression remained calm, almost regretful. He slowly placed one hand on the leather portfolio beside his chair. Joe felt something tighten inside his chest. Not fear, recognition. For months he had wondered whether William had noticed the same inconsistencies. Now he knew. William looked across nearly 100 silent guests. Then he spoke only 7 words. "I believe we've heard enough from Gabriella." No one breathed. William rested his hand firmly on the portfolio. His eyes never left his daughter. Then, with the same measured composure that had once controlled federal courtrooms, he said, "Now I'd like everyone to hear the evidence." The room stayed silent. Not the ordinary silence that followed bad news. This was the silence of nearly 100 successful people realizing they might have judged a situation far too quickly. William Whitmore did not raise his voice. He simply rested one hand on the dark leather portfolio lying beside his chair. For more than 30 years, he had presided over federal courtrooms where shouting accomplished nothing and evidence decided everything. Old habits never disappeared. They merely became quieter. William looked around the ballroom before speaking again. "I've listened to my daughter." His voice remained steady. "I believe everyone here has." Nobody interrupted. William slowly turned toward Evelyn. "I'm sorry this has happened during your birthday." Evelyn lowered her eyes and nodded once. There was sadness on her face, but not confusion anymore. She knew her husband well enough to understand that he would never interrupt a family gathering without an extraordinary reason. William picked up the portfolio. The brass clasp clicked softly as he unlocked it. That tiny metallic sound echoed through the ballroom more loudly than anyone expected. Joe watched carefully. His heartbeat remained even, but his attention sharpened. He had wondered for weeks whether William had discovered the same irregularities. The answer was now sitting inside that leather folder. Gabriella folded her arms. "Dad." Her tone remained controlled. "Whatever this is, I'd appreciate if we handled it privately." William looked at her. "No." The answer came immediately. "This became public when you chose to make it public." Nobody spoke. Gabriella forced a polite smile. "I announced a divorce. You accused your husband of dishonesty and failure before nearly 100 witnesses." William's eyes never left hers. "That is no longer a private matter." Several guests quietly shifted in their chairs. Thomas Grayson lowered his glass. The attorney sitting near William leaned forward. Joe noticed Rebecca Lawson had not yet arrived. He had not expected her to attend the birthday party. She knew enough to stay away unless he called. William carefully removed the first document from the portfolio. He did not hand it to anyone. Instead, he held it where Gabriella could clearly see it. "Do you recognize the name East River Development Partners?" For the first time that evening, Gabriella hesitated. Only a fraction of a second. But Joe saw it. Years of inspecting structures had trained him to notice tiny changes, hairline cracks, uneven settlement. A hesitation could be just as revealing, Gabriella answered calmly. "It sounds familiar." William nodded. "I expected that answer." He placed the document on the table, then removed another. "What about Franklin Asset Management, LLC?" Gabriella shrugged. "I've worked with hundreds of companies." "Have you?" William asked. "I don't remember all of them." Again, William simply nodded. No anger, no accusation. He removed a third document, then a fourth. Each page had color-coded tabs attached to its edge. Joe immediately recognized the organization. Someone had prepared these files professionally. Not overnight. Not during the past week. Months of work. William wasn't improvising. He had built a case. Joe realized something else. The papers were not ordinary business records. Some pages carried notarized certifications. Others displayed accounting summaries. Several appeared to be corporate registration documents issued by the Ohio Secretary of State. This investigation had gone much farther than Joe imagined. One of the guests finally spoke. It was Charles Benton, president of a regional commercial bank. "William," his voice sounded cautious. "What exactly are we looking at?" William answered without taking his eyes off Gabriella. "Questions." Charles frowned. "Questions. The answers determine whether this evening remains a family disagreement." William paused. "No, or become something federal." A ripple moved through the ballroom. Someone quietly whispered. Federal Joe remained perfectly still. He noticed Gabriella tightening her grip around the stem of her champagne glass. Not enough for anyone else to notice. Enough for him. William picked up another sheet. "This LLC," he tapped the page gently, "was created 22 months ago." No response. "It purchased 3 commercial properties." Silence. "It reported consulting expenses exceeding $3 million. Gabriella remained expressionless. William continued. "It also received engineering approvals." Now Joe looked directly at the document. Engineering approvals. Exactly where everything had begun. William slowly turned toward Joe. "Joe." His voice softened slightly. "Have you ever performed engineering work for East River Development Partners?" Joe answered immediately. "No." William nodded. "Have you ever met anyone representing that company?" "No." "Have you ever submitted invoices to them?" "No." William looked around the ballroom. "Those are the answers I expected," Gabriella finally interrupted. "What's your point?" William placed another document onto the table. "My point is that someone approved engineering documents using Joe's professional credentials." Several people looked toward Joe. Gabriella laughed softly. "That's ridiculous." "Is it?" William asked. "You tell me." She crossed her arms again. "If Joe's name appears somewhere, maybe he forgot." Joe almost smiled. Forgot professional engineers did not forget sealed structural approvals. Each approval carried legal responsibility. Every signature mattered. William carefully lifted another page. "This approval bears Joe Ramirez's engineering license number." He looked toward Joe. "Did you authorize it?" "No." "Did you sign it?" "No." "Did you review it?" "No." William simply answered, "I didn't think so." Thomas Grayson looked visibly uncomfortable now. "So," he hesitated, "are you saying somebody forged his approval?" William didn't answer immediately. Instead, he returned every document into perfect alignment. Joe appreciated that detail. William always organized papers before making important statements, another courtroom habit. Finally, William spoke. "I am saying only what I can prove." The distinction mattered. Joe admired it. Too many people confused suspicion with evidence. William never had. "I retained outside legal counsel 6 weeks ago." More whispers spread across the room. "I also retained independent forensic accountants." Now nearly everyone stared at him. Gabriella's expression remained calm, but Joe noticed she had stopped drinking her champagne. "Interesting," William continued. "I intentionally hired professionals with no previous relationship to our family." He looked briefly toward Charles Benton. "No Whitmore employee participated. No Whitmore accountant reviewed these records. No Whitmore attorney prepared these findings." Another deliberate pause. "I wanted independent conclusions." Someone quietly asked, "And what did they conclude?" William looked down at this folder. "They concluded that multiple commercial property transactions require immediate explanation." Gabriella stepped forward. "So this is about accounting." Her tone carried a trace of relief. "You interrupted my mother's birthday because accountants found bookkeeping issues," William answered without emotion. "No." He reached deeper into the portfolio. This time he removed a thick, sealed envelope. Across its front appeared a bright red stamp. "Confidential. Attorney-client privileged. Joe recognized the label immediately. Rebecca Lawson used identical envelopes whenever she delivered protected legal materials. William held the envelope for only a second. Then he placed it gently beside the stack of documents. The accounting issues were only the beginning. Nobody moved. Nobody even reached for another drink. William slowly looked back toward Gabriella. I asked investigators one simple question. His voice remained almost conversational. If these transactions were legitimate, he tapped the envelope once. Why did every trail eventually lead back to one person? The question hung in the air. Gabriella's smile disappeared. Only briefly. Only enough for Joe to notice. William noticed too. The retired judge quietly opened the sealed envelope. Inside lay several photographs, corporate ownership charts, certified banking records, and one engineering approval printed in full color. He lifted that final document carefully. Joe saw his own professional engineering seal printed across the bottom. His signature. Perfectly reproduced. Perfectly false. William looked directly at Gabriella. Then he asked the question that caused every person in the ballroom to stop breathing. Would you like to explain why your husband's engineering license appears on documents he never saw? Nobody answered William's question. The ballroom had become so quiet that the soft hum of the air conditioning system sounded unusually loud. Gabriella looked at the document bearing Joe's forged engineering seal for several long seconds before lifting her eyes toward her father. You can't seriously believe I had anything to do with that. Her voice remained calm, controlled. But Joe noticed something that had been absent all evening. She was no longer speaking to the audience. She was speaking only to William. That change mattered. William laid the document flat on the table. I haven't accused you of anything. You just implied it. I asked you a question. They're the same thing. No. William folded his hands together. They are very different. Joe remembered hearing William explain something similar years earlier during dinner. Facts, assumptions, conclusions. They were never supposed to be mixed together. The retired judge had built an entire career separating them. Charles Benton stood from his chair. If I may, William nodded. Charles approached cautiously until he stood beside the banquet table. He looked down at the engineering approval. I'm not an engineer. He glanced toward Joe. But I finance commercial developments. Joe nodded politely. Charles continued. If an approval like this were fraudulent. He hesitated. What would happen? Joe answered honestly. The engineer whose seal appears on the document would likely become one of the first people investigators contact. Several guests exchanged uneasy glances. Joe continued. The engineering seal represents professional responsibility. If a building later develops structural problems or financial irregularities are discovered, every signature is examined. Charles frowned. So, whoever appears to have approved the project must explain every decision, Joe finished. Exactly. William looked around the room, which is why this document concerns me. He opened another section of the portfolio. This folder contained bank records, not originals, certified copies. Each page carried authentication stamps. William carefully spread several sheets across the white linen tablecloth. Joe immediately noticed highlighted transfers, yellow, blue, pink. Every color represented something different. Someone had organized the records with extraordinary care. William tapped the first page. 3 months after East River Development Partners was incorporated, this company received a transfer of $940,000. No one reacted. Most people didn't recognize the company. William pointed toward another highlighted section. 5 days later, his finger moved lower. $885,000 left the account. He paused. It was sent to another company. He revealed another page. Franklin Asset Management, LLC. Joe stepped slightly closer. He had never seen these records before, but the pattern immediately caught his attention. Money entered. Money left. Almost the entire amount. Minimal operating expenses, minimal payroll, minimal taxes. For a company supposedly managing commercial developments, the activity looked strangely empty. William continued. 2 weeks later. Another page. Franklin Asset Management transferred approximately $840,000 to Horizon Property Consulting. Another unfamiliar company. Another nearly identical transaction. Thomas Grayson frowned. Those are unusual movements. William looked toward him. They are, but not illegal by themselves. Joe appreciated the decision again. William refused to exaggerate. Every sentence stayed within what the documents actually showed. One of the younger attorneys raised a hand slightly. Could these simply be consulting payments? They could, William replied. That possibility was examined. He reached into the folder again. This time he removed invoices. Dozens of them. Every invoice appeared professionally designed. Corporate logos, addresses, payment terms. Everything looked legitimate. Until William handed the first one to Charles Benton. Charles studied it, then frowned. This invoice doesn't describe any services. It says strategic consulting. Yes? But strategic consulting for what? Charles looked again. There wasn't an answer, only vague language. Another guest accepted a different invoice. So does this one, someone else quietly added. And mine. William nodded. The forensic accountants noticed the same pattern. Joe crossed his arms thoughtfully. Months earlier, he had focused almost entirely on engineering approvals. William had followed the financial trail instead. 2 separate investigations. The same destination. Gabriella suddenly laughed. The sound startled several guests. This is unbelievable. She shook her head. Consulting invoices? She looked around the room. Every large company uses consultants. Several executives nodded automatically. She wasn't wrong. Consultants were common. William agreed. They are. He waited, then added quietly, real consultants usually exist. The room became silent again. Gabriella's smile faded. William removed another document. This invoice lists an office in Cleveland. He looked toward one of the attorneys. I asked investigators to visit. The attorney already knew the answer. What did they find? William turned the page. The address belongs to an empty mailbox rental. Another whisper spread across the ballroom. He revealed another invoice. This company lists headquarters in Cincinnati. He waited again. The building manager confirmed no such business has ever leased space there. Another invoice. Columbus. Another answer. Vacant office. Joe felt the tension growing. Not because the evidence proved everything. It didn't. Not yet. But every answer created another question. Questions accumulated. And eventually unanswered questions formed patterns. William laid 3 photographs beside the invoices. Each showed an office building. Each building appeared ordinary. One displayed an empty suite. Another contained a shipping store offering mailbox rentals. The third showed a boarded storefront. Gabriella remained motionless. William finally looked directly at her. Can you identify anyone who actually works for these consulting firms? She answered immediately. No. Have you met their employees? No. Have you visited any of these offices? No. William nodded once. Neither has anyone else. Joe noticed Charles Benton rubbing his forehead. Something was beginning to trouble him. If these companies aren't real, he looked toward William. Who received the money? William answered carefully. That question remains under investigation. Joe recognized another deliberate choice of words. Under investigation. Not proven, not assumed, simply investigated. William picked up one final page. Unlike the others, this wasn't a financial record. It was a corporate registration. He placed it in front of Gabriella. This company, he tapped the document, was organized by a registered agent. She glanced down. So? The registered agent resigned after 6 months. So, William slid another page beside it. The replacement paperwork lists a different contact. Gabriella remained silent. William continued. That contact used a personal email address. Joe leaned slightly closer. Something about William's tone had changed. Not louder, sharper. The email account recovered by investigators used the initials GW. Several people looked toward Gabriella. Her full maiden name was Gabriella Whitmore. She folded her arms more tightly. Lots of people have those initials. Correct. William agreed immediately, which is why investigators requested additional records. Joe's attention sharpened. Requested, not obtained. That meant this portion of the investigation was still unfolding. William wasn't claiming certainty. He was explaining process, exactly the way a judge should. One elderly businessman spoke from the back of the room. William. His voice carried decades of friendship. What made you start looking into any of this? William didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned towards Joe. For months, he said quietly, I believed my son-in-law was hiding something. Joe looked at him without speaking. William continued. I noticed he became unusually cautious. He stopped discussing work. He began reading documents more carefully during family dinners. He often looked exhausted. I assumed he was under financial pressure. Joe remembered those evenings. He had indeed been distracted. Not because he feared losing money, because he feared someone was preparing to destroy his professional reputation. William looked down briefly. I was wrong. The admission surprised everyone. I eventually asked Joe a direct question. Joe remembered it clearly. It had happened in William's study 6 weeks earlier. William had asked, Is there something you aren't telling me? Joe had answered yes. William had remained silent, then asked, Can you tell me? Joe had shaken his head. Not yet. Back in the ballroom, William spoke softly. I thought his silence meant guilt. He looked toward Joe. It actually meant caution. Joe said nothing. William faced the guests again. I have spent 40 years evaluating evidence. He rested one hand on the portfolio. And I have learned something. He paused. The loudest accusation is rarely the strongest one. He looked directly at Gabriella. Which is why I hired people whose only loyalty was to the truth. Then he slowly reached into the bottom compartment of the portfolio. Joe immediately recognized that compartment. It contained the documents William had intentionally kept hidden until now. Whatever rested inside was important enough to save for last. William removed a slim black flash drive. He placed it gently beside the stack of financial records. Then he said the words that caused every attorney in the room to straighten in their chairs. The paper records raised questions. He looked at the flash drive. But the digital evidence answered them. 4 months before Evelyn Whitmore's birthday, Joe Ramirez noticed something that most engineers would have dismissed as an administrative mistake. He was reviewing structural revisions for a mixed-use commercial development on the northern edge of Columbus. The project itself was routine. Steel framing, reinforced concrete parking levels, retail space on the ground floor, apartments above. Joe had reviewed hundreds of similar projects. He opened the revised drawing package shortly after 6 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, coffee still steaming beside his keyboard. The approval page appeared normal. Project number, permit reference, engineering revision history, his professional seal, his digital signature, everything appeared exactly as it should. Except he had never signed it. Joe leaned back in his chair. His first thought was simple. The software must have synchronized the wrong version. He checked the revision history. Nothing unusual. He checked the timestamp. 2:17 p.m., the previous Thursday. He frowned. At 2:17 p.m., the previous Thursday, he had been standing inside a deteriorating parking garage in Cincinnati with 2 city inspectors. His phone still contained photographs from that inspection. He certainly had not been sitting in his office approving structural modifications. Joe opened his calendar. The meeting records confirmed it. He had spent nearly 6 consecutive hours away from his computer. He opened the company's internal login records. According to the system, the approval had been submitted using his employee credentials. That made no sense. Joe was careful with passwords. He used 2-factor authentication whenever possible. He had never shared his credentials with anyone. Instead of reporting the issue immediately, he decided to verify every possibility first. Perhaps he had approved an earlier version. Perhaps an automated process had attached the wrong seal. Perhaps someone in the drafting department had accidentally copied an archived approval sheet. He searched previous revisions. Nothing matched. The structural calculations were different. The beam schedules had changed. The foundation layout had been modified. Someone had attached his engineering approval to documents he had never reviewed. Joe quietly printed the file. Then he highlighted every revision he could identify. He placed the pages into a plain manila folder. No labels. No notes. Only dates. By lunchtime, he had almost convinced himself the matter would be resolved with a single conversation. It wasn't. The drafting supervisor looked confused. "Our system shows you approved it." "I didn't." "The log says you did." Joe remained calm. "Can you show me the original upload?" The supervisor searched for several minutes before shaking his head. "It isn't here." "What do you mean?" "The approval history exists." He clicked through several menus, but the original upload file is missing. Joe said nothing. That answer bothered him far more than the forged approval itself. Digital records rarely disappeared without reason. Someone from information technology later explained that archived files occasionally became corrupted during server migrations. The explanation sounded reasonable, but Joe still wasn't satisfied. He requested an internal review. 2 weeks later, the response arrived. No irregularities found. Case closed. Joe stared at the email for nearly a minute. No irregularities. He reopened the forged approval. His signature was still there. His seal was still there. The missing upload file was still missing, yet somehow there were no irregularities. That evening, Joe drove home unusually late. Rain covered Interstate 70, forcing traffic to crawl toward Columbus. Instead of turning on the radio, he replayed every conversation from the previous 2 weeks. Nothing fit together. Engineers were trained to investigate failures. When steel fractured, there was always a reason. When concrete cracked, the cause could be identified. Random failures were rare. Human errors happened. Patterns did not. 3 days later, another project crossed his desk. Another commercial redevelopment. Another approval package. Another engineering seal. Again. His signature appeared on revisions he had never seen. This time, Joe didn't report it. He quietly saved every file onto an encrypted external drive. He exported the metadata. He recorded the download time. He photographed every printed page beside that day's newspaper. His father had once told him something after a neighbor falsely blamed him for damaging a fence. Memory fades. Paper doesn't. Joe trusted documents more than arguments. Over the following month, the pattern continued. Different developments, different clients, different contractors. The same unexplained approvals. Some involved only minor structural revisions. Others approved significant design changes affecting load-bearing components. Joe never panicked. Instead, he became methodical. He created folders organized by date. Every document received a number. Every email received a backup copy. Every system log was preserved before anyone could modify it. He even purchased a second encrypted drive that remained locked inside a small, fireproof safe at home. He told no one. Not because he enjoyed keeping secrets, because he no longer knew whom he could trust. One Friday afternoon, he noticed something else. Every suspicious approval involved developments financed by companies he had never heard of. East River Development Partners, Franklin Asset Management, Horizon Property Consulting. The name sounded legitimate, almost intentionally ordinary. He searched public records during his lunch break. Very little information appeared. Several companies had been formed within months of each other. Most listed registered agents instead of actual executives. Several shared mailing addresses. Joe printed those records too. At first, he still believed someone inside the company was committing accounting fraud and using his engineering credentials to speed construction approvals. He had no reason to connect any of it to Gabriella. Not yet. She worked in commercial acquisitions. He worked in structural engineering. Their careers occasionally crossed paths, but rarely in day-to-day operations. Then something happened at dinner. Gabriella answered a phone call while standing on the back patio. Joe wasn't trying to listen. He simply stepped outside to bring in the empty glasses. As he opened the sliding door, he heard only a single sentence. "Don't send anything through the company account." She turned immediately after speaking. Seeing Joe, she smiled. "Business never stops." He smiled back. "I know." Neither mentioned the conversation again. But Joe remembered the exact words. "Don't send anything through the company account." The sentence returned to him repeatedly over the following weeks. Standing alone in his office one Saturday morning, Joe looked at the growing stack of documents covering his desk. Engineering approvals, corporate registrations, email logs, server timestamps, calendar entries. Everything pointed toward deliberate manipulation. Nothing yet identified the person responsible. He realized he needed professional advice, not from another engineer, not from company management, from someone who understood investigations. That Monday, he searched quietly for an attorney specializing in complex white-collar matters. One name appeared repeatedly: Rebecca Lawson, former federal prosecutor, now one of Ohio's most respected white-collar defense attorneys. Joe requested a confidential consultation using his personal email. 3 days later, he sat across from Rebecca inside a modest conference room overlooking downtown Columbus. She listened without interrupting for nearly an hour. Joe handed her only copies. Never originals. When he finished, Rebecca remained silent for several moments. Finally, she asked one question. "Has anyone accused you of misconduct yet?" "No." "Have investigators contacted you?" "No." "Does anyone know you're collecting this evidence?" "No." Rebecca nodded slowly. "Good." Joe frowned. "Good." She folded her hands across the conference table. "If someone is building a case against you, the worst thing you can do is announce that you've discovered it." Joe felt a chill. "You think someone is building a case?" Rebecca chose her words carefully. "I think someone is creating documents that place legal responsibility on your shoulders." She pointed toward the forged engineering approvals. "Whether the goal is financial fraud, regulatory fraud, or something else I can't say yet." She looked directly at him. "But from this moment forward, you document everything. Every email. Every meeting. Every phone call. Every revision." She slid a legal pad toward him. "And most importantly..." Joe waited. Rebecca's voice became almost stern. "You do not confront anyone until you understand the entire picture." Joe slowly nodded. Walking back to his truck that afternoon, he understood something he had been unwilling to admit before. The forged signatures were not isolated mistakes. Someone had spent months carefully positioning him exactly where investigators would eventually look. And for the first time since discovering the false approvals, Joe realized he might not simply be witnessing a fraud. He might be the person chosen to take the blame. Rebecca Lawson insisted that Joe leave her office through the rear exit. It seemed excessive, until she explained why. "If someone is manipulating corporate records," she said as they walked toward the parking garage, You should assume they are also paying attention to people who ask questions. Joe glanced toward the nearly empty street. You think I'm being watched? I think you shouldn't assume you aren't. There was no drama in her voice, only experience. She handed him a small business card with a handwritten number on the back. This isn't my office line. Joe studied the number. Use it only if something changes. What qualifies as something changing? Rebecca smiled faintly. You receive legal papers. Someone asks unusual questions. You discover another forged document. Or someone suddenly becomes interested in your work. Joe slipped the card into his wallet. I understand. As he drove home, he resisted the urge to look constantly into his rear-view mirror. Rebecca had not told him he was being followed. She had told him to remain observant. There was a difference. That evening, Gabriella arrived home unusually late. She walked into the kitchen, still talking on her phone. I'm almost there, she said. Move tomorrow's meeting to 8. She ended the call before Joe could hear the response. Long day, he asked. She sighed dramatically. Acquisition meetings. She opened the refrigerator. Everyone wants everything yesterday. Joe smiled politely. I know the feeling. She kissed him lightly on the cheek. I'll be in my office for another hour. Nothing about her behavior appeared suspicious. Nothing unusual. Yet Joe found himself paying attention in ways he never had before, not searching for guilt, simply noticing details. She carried 2 phones instead of 1. She had started locking the study door during conference calls. Several evenings each week, she drove to meetings that were never added to the family calendar. Individually, none of those things meant anything. Together, they formed another pattern. Joe wrote them down. Not conclusions, observations. Rebecca had emphasized the distinction. 3 weeks later, another unexpected development occurred. An email arrived from the Ohio Department of Commerce requesting clarification regarding engineering documentation connected to a commercial redevelopment project. The tone remained courteous, routine. But Joe immediately recognized the project number. It matched one of the forged approvals stored inside his safe. He answered carefully. He explained that he was reviewing internal records before providing additional documentation. The department granted him 5 business days. Instead of replying again, Joe drove directly to Rebecca's office. She read the email twice. Then she looked at him. It has started. Joe remained calm. What has... the paperwork? She leaned back in her chair. When fraudulent documentation exists, government agencies eventually begin asking questions. She tapped the email. This is still informal. But it won't remain that way forever. Joe asked the question that had been growing in his mind for weeks. What do I do? Rebecca answered immediately. We stay ahead of the documents. Over the following month, they created a timeline. Every legitimate project Joe had approved, every day he had traveled, every inspection, every vacation, every conference. His calendar became evidence. His expense reports became evidence. His toll road receipts became evidence. Even family photographs became evidence. One picture showed Joe standing beside his parents during a Sunday barbecue. The timestamp matched an engineering approval supposedly signed from his office that same afternoon. Rebecca smiled for the first time. Keep this. Joe looked surprised. A family photograph? A digital photograph with original metadata. She nodded. Jurors understand pictures. The investigation slowly expanded. Rebecca hired a digital forensics specialist. His name was Ethan Brooks. He had spent 15 years recovering deleted corporate files. Unlike television investigators, Ethan rarely made dramatic discoveries in minutes. He worked patiently, hour after hour, log after log, backup after backup. One Friday evening, he called Rebecca. She immediately invited Joe to her office. Ethan projected a series of login records onto a conference room screen. Your company stores authentication logs longer than they realize. Joe studied the timestamps. Most meant nothing to him. Then Ethan enlarged one entry. This login originated from Joe's account. Joe nodded. Yes. Ethan highlighted the location. But not from Joe's workstation. Another location appeared. Conference room 4. Joe frowned. I wasn't there. I know. Ethan displayed another entry, then another. Every forged engineering approval originated from the same conference room. Not Joe's office, not his laptop, always conference room 4. Rebecca leaned forward. Who normally uses that room? Joe thought carefully. Executive strategy meetings. Acquisition teams. Senior management. He stopped speaking. Gabriella frequently attended those meetings. Rebecca noticed his expression. What? Joe shook his head. It doesn't prove anything. No, Rebecca agreed. It doesn't. But it narrows the field. Joe drove to the office early the following Monday. He had no intention of investigating anyone. He simply wanted to see conference room 4. The room looked completely ordinary. Large display screen, conference table, glass walls, nothing unusual. Then he noticed something mounted beneath the table. A docking station. Employees could connect laptops directly to the internal engineering server without visiting individual departments. Convenient, efficient, and capable of accessing shared project files. Joe quietly photographed the setup. Not secretly. The room wasn't restricted. He simply documented what he saw. Later that afternoon, he encountered Derek Holloway in the lobby. The commercial real estate developer had worked with Whitmore Commercial Holdings for years. Derek greeted him warmly. Joe? Good to see you. You too. Derek glanced toward the elevators. You headed upstairs? No. I'm leaving. Derek laughed. Lucky you. Then, almost casually, he added, I just finished another acquisition meeting with Gabriella. Joe smiled. Busy week. Always. The elevator doors opened. Before stepping inside, Derek turned back. You know, he hesitated. Your wife is incredible during negotiations. Joe nodded. She works hard. Harder than anyone. The doors closed. Joe remained standing in the lobby. Another observation. Nothing more. That evening, he added Derek's comment to his notebook. Weeks passed. The evidence continued growing. Not dramatically, quietly. Login records, missing files, corporate registrations, government inquiries, server access logs. One Friday, Rebecca called unexpectedly. I think it's time. Joe recognized the seriousness in her voice. For what? You need to tell someone inside your family. Joe remained silent. I've been thinking about that, Rebecca answered carefully. If this investigation reaches public authorities before someone trustworthy knows the truth, you'll appear defensive. Joe already knew whom she meant. William Whitmore, the retired federal judge. A man who respected evidence more than reputation. A man who would never protect wrongdoing simply because it involved his own family. Still, Joe hesitated. If I'm wrong, Rebecca interrupted gently. You've spent months trying to prove yourself wrong. She gestured toward the stacks of organized evidence filling her conference room. And every document has led in the same direction. Joe finally nodded. I'll talk to him. 2 evenings later, William invited Joe to his private study after dinner. Books lined every wall. Federal reporters, legal history, constitutional law. The room smelled faintly of old leather and coffee. William poured 2 cups, then looked directly at Joe. You've been carrying something for a long time. Joe stared at the coffee. How did you know? William smiled sadly. I spent 40 years watching witnesses. You've had the same expression for months. Joe took a slow breath. Then he opened his briefcase. Inside rested a single manila folder. Not the entire just enough to begin. He placed it carefully on William's desk. I need you to read this. William didn't touch it immediately. Instead, he asked one question. If I open this folder, Joe met his eyes. Our family may never be the same again. William remained silent for several seconds. Then, with the deliberate calm that had guided thousands of legal decisions throughout his career, he reached forward, opened the folder, and began reading the first page. Neither man realized that moment would become the true beginning of everything that unfolded at Evelyn Whitmore's birthday party 4 months later. William Whitmore did not speak for nearly 20 minutes. The grandfather clock in his study marked each passing minute with a quiet, mechanical click. Joe sat across from him without interruption. He had already said everything that mattered. Now the documents needed to speak for themselves. William examined each page with the same deliberate patience that had defined his years on the federal bench. He never skimmed, he never jumped ahead. Every date, every signature, every highlighted notation received equal attention. When he reached the forged engineering approval bearing Joe's professional seal, he removed his reading glasses and placed them carefully on the desk. "You're certain you never approved this?" Joe answered without hesitation. "I'm certain." William compared the signature on the document with one Joe had legitimately signed months earlier. At first glance, they appeared identical. Then William pointed toward the bottom corner. "The pressure pattern is wrong." Joe looked surprised. "You noticed that?" William nodded. "I've examined questioned signatures in court for decades." He traced the final letter of Joe's last name. "The signature itself is convincing." His finger moved to another page. "But whoever copied it reproduced the shape?" He looked at Joe. "Not the rhythm." Joe understood immediately. A genuine signature flowed naturally. A copied one often paused almost imperceptibly between strokes. Most people never noticed. William always had. He continued reading. The login records, the server timestamps, the government inquiry, the corporate registrations. Every few pages he asked a short question. Every answer matched the documents. Finally, he closed the folder. "When did you first suspect this was intentional?" "After the second forged approval." "And why didn't you come to me?" Joe looked down briefly before answering. "Because I didn't know where the evidence would lead." William remained silent. "I wasn't willing to accuse anyone based on suspicion." A faint expression of respect crossed William's face. "Good." Joe looked up. "I've seen families destroy themselves because people reached conclusions before collecting facts." William folded his hands. "You did the opposite." He leaned back in his chair. "You collected facts before reaching conclusions." Joe exhaled quietly. "I learned that from you." For the first time that evening, William smiled, only slightly. The smile disappeared almost immediately. "There is one question I need answered." Joe nodded. "Ask." William's eyes became unusually serious. "Do you suspect Gabriella?" The room became silent. Joe had anticipated that question from the moment he decided to reveal the investigation. He answered slowly. "I don't know." William studied him carefully. "I expected a different answer." Joe shook his head. "I've seen evidence connecting these transactions to meetings she attended." He paused. "I've seen login records originating from conference rooms used by her department." Another pause. "But I have never seen evidence proving she created the forged documents." William nodded. "Important distinction." Joe continued. "I refuse to accuse someone because circumstances look suspicious." William stood and walked toward the window overlooking the backyard. Rain had begun falling lightly outside. He remained there for nearly a minute before speaking again. "When I became a judge?" He kept looking outside. "I promised myself something." Joe waited. "I would never protect wrongdoing simply because the accused shared my last name." He turned back. "I've kept that promise for 33 years." Joe believed him, without question. William returned to the desk. I want copies. You'll have them. I also want to verify everything independently. I expected you would. William almost laughed. You know me well. The following morning, William made no telephone calls to family members. Instead, he contacted an attorney in Cleveland whom he had trusted for more than 20 years. Richard Ames specialized in corporate compliance investigations. Unlike Rebecca Lawson, Richard had never met Joe. He had no relationship with Whitmore Commercial Holdings. He was exactly what William wanted. Independent. 3 days later, Richard arrived carrying 2 empty storage boxes. He spent an entire afternoon reviewing every document Joe had assembled. When he finished, he asked only one question. May I conduct my own investigation? William answered immediately. That's why you're here. Richard nodded. I won't promise conclusions. I don't want conclusions, William replied. I want facts. Richard smiled. Then we'll get along. Over the next 6 weeks, Richard assembled a small investigative team, a forensic accountant, a digital evidence specialist, a retired banking compliance officer. None of them knew the Whitmore family personally. Each signed strict confidentiality agreements. Each received only the information necessary for his or her assignment. William intentionally separated the investigation into independent sections. No single investigator saw the complete picture. He wanted objective findings rather than collaborative assumptions. Meanwhile, Joe continued living as though nothing had changed. He went to work every morning, reviewed engineering plans, visited construction sites, attended ordinary meetings. If anyone inside the company suspected he was documenting evidence, they never showed it. Gabriella remained busy with acquisitions. She traveled frequently. Chicago, Indianapolis, Louisville, Detroit. Sometimes she returned home after midnight. Other times she left before sunrise. Their conversations became increasingly ordinary. What time will you be home? Probably late. Do you want dinner? I'll grab something on the road. Neither argued. Neither questioned the other. From the outside, they appeared to be another successful professional couple, struggling with demanding careers. Only Joe knew how carefully he now observed every passing day. One afternoon, Rebecca called unexpectedly. Richard Ames contacted me. Joe frowned. I didn't know William had spoken with you. He hadn't. Rebecca smiled. Richard introduced himself professionally. Joe understood immediately. The investigators were comparing notes, without sharing conclusions, exactly as experienced attorneys should. What did you tell him? Only facts I could independently verify. Joe appreciated that answer. Nothing more, nothing less. 2 weeks later, William received Richard's first interim report. It contained no accusations, only verified findings. 5 shell companies had exchanged millions of dollars through unusually circular financial transfers. 4 engineering approvals carried Joe's professional seal, despite lacking evidence that Joe had ever accessed the original project files. 3 corporate email accounts had been deleted shortly after regulatory inquiries began. Several consulting firms appeared to exist only on paper. William read the report twice. Then he locked it inside his study safe. He still wasn't ready to confront anyone. Not yet. He wanted certainty. Another week passed. Then Richard requested an urgent meeting. He arrived carrying a sealed evidence envelope. I believe we've identified the missing link. William remained seated. What kind of link? Richard placed the envelope on the desk. The shell companies. The engineering approvals. The financial transfers. He paused. They all intersect. William felt his pulse quicken for the first time in weeks. How? Richard removed a certified corporate filing from the envelope. This document identifies the individual authorized to approve operational decisions for one of the holding companies. William adjusted his glasses. The signature line had been redacted for privacy by the records office. but another section remained visible. An email address, a recovery telephone number, and a mailing address. William recognized the address immediately. It belonged to a private executive office leased by Whitmore Commercial Holdings. Not proof, but significant. Richard spoke carefully. This still doesn't establish criminal responsibility. William nodded. I understand. But it establishes access. Richard answered. Yes. It narrows the field considerably. William closed the file. I have one request. Richard waited. No one confronts anyone. Agreed. No interviews. No warnings. No accusations. Richard smiled faintly. I was hoping you'd say that. William looked toward the locked study safe. Whoever created this scheme has spent years preparing it. He rested one hand on the report. If we move too early, he finished quietly, the evidence may disappear before the truth has a chance to speak. Richard nodded. Then we keep collecting. William looked out the window toward the quiet backyard. Evelyn was outside tending her rose bushes, completely unaware that an investigation was slowly reaching toward the heart of her own family. He closed the curtains gently. In that moment, he made a decision that would ultimately change everything. He would say nothing. Not to Gabriella, not to Evelyn, not even to Joe, until the evidence became so complete that no reasonable person could deny it. Months later, when Gabriella chose Evelyn's birthday celebration to publicly announce her divorce, William already knew he would not interrupt her. He would let her finish. Because sometimes the strongest evidence was not hidden inside a folder. Sometimes it was allowing someone to reveal exactly who they believed no one was watching. The applause that had followed Gabriella's announcement had vanished. No one in the ballroom was thinking about the birthday anymore. Every pair of eyes remained fixed on William Whitmore. The retired federal judge stood quietly beside the banquet table, one hand resting on the leather portfolio that had changed the atmosphere of the evening. The flash drive remained beside the stack of documents. No one had touched it. William looked around the room before speaking again. I want everyone here to understand something. His voice remained calm. I have not accused anyone of committing a crime. He paused. I have presented facts that required explanation. Several attorneys in attendance nodded. They recognized the distinction immediately. William continued. For months, independent investigators examined financial records, engineering documents, electronic access logs, and public corporate filings. He glanced briefly toward Joe. They did so without knowing what conclusions I expected. He looked back toward the guests. Because I expected none. Joe remained silent. Rebecca Lawson had taught him that truth became stronger when it did not need exaggeration. William picked up the flash drive. This contains copies of the digital records recovered during that investigation. He placed it back on the table. I will not display them here. A few guests looked surprised. Gabriella folded her arms. Why not? William met her eyes. Because this is still your mother's birthday. The answer caught everyone off guard. Even now, he refused to turn the evening into a public trial. Evelyn looked at her husband with tears beginning to form in her eyes. William's expression softened. I'm trying to protect what remains of this evening. Then he faced Gabriella again. But I will ask you one final question. The ballroom became perfectly still. Did you know Joe's engineering credentials appeared on projects he never approved? Gabriella answered immediately. No. William nodded. Very well. Did you ever authorize anyone to use his professional seal? No. Did you ever participate in meetings involving East River Development Partners? She hesitated. Yes. Franklin Asset Management? Yes. Horizon Property Consulting? Yes. Another murmur moved through the room. William did not react. Were you aware those companies transferred millions of dollars through multiple shell entities? I wasn't responsible for accounting. Were you aware that several listed business addresses did not contain functioning offices? I never checked. Were you aware that investigators could not locate employees for those consulting firms? Gabriella's confidence began to weaken. I wasn't responsible for hiring consultants. William simply nodded after every answer. He never argued. He never interrupted. He merely allowed the answers to accumulate. Joe watched carefully. Years earlier, William had once explained cross-examination over dinner. "You never force a witness into a contradiction," he had said. "You simply give them enough room to arrive there themselves." Joe finally understood exactly what he had meant. Charles Benton quietly stood. "William?" He spoke cautiously. "May I ask something?" "Of course." Charles turned toward Gabriella. "You've worked on acquisitions involving those companies." "Yes. Did you ever personally verify who owned them?" Gabriella frowned. "That wasn't my responsibility." Charles looked uncomfortable. "In transactions worth millions of dollars. Our legal department handled ownership verification." One of the attorneys seated nearby quietly spoke. "Which legal department?" Gabriella answered without thinking. "Outside counsel." "Which outside counsel?" She hesitated. For the first time that evening, she did not have an immediate answer. Joe noticed something else. Several executives from Whitmore Commercial Holdings were exchanging uncertain looks. Apparently, they had assumed someone else handled those reviews as well. William remained patient. "No one is asking for perfection." He spoke gently. "We're asking for facts." He reached into the portfolio one final time. Instead of another financial document, he removed a printed email. This message was recovered from archived backups. He held it carefully. The sender instructed recipients to avoid using company email accounts for discussions involving acquisition schedules. Gabriella's face changed almost imperceptibly. Joe recognized the expression. He had seen it once before, months earlier, standing on their back patio, when she had said into her phone, "Don't send anything through the company account." William looked directly at her. "Have you ever given that instruction?" She remained silent for several seconds, then answered, "I may have." The ballroom stirred. William continued calmly. "Why?" She lifted her chin. "Because confidential negotiations sometimes require discretion." "Reasonable," William agreed immediately. "No one disputes that." He placed the email beside the other documents, but investigators found the same instruction repeated numerous times. He looked down at the page. "Use personal accounts. Delete draft copies. Do not copy company servers." He raised his eyes again. "Can you explain that?" Gabriella drew a slow breath. "Our competitors monitor everything." One executive nodded instinctively. Corporate confidentiality was common. William acknowledged that. "It is." Then he asked, "Was Joe part of those confidential communications?" "No." "Why not?" "He wasn't involved in acquisitions." William looked toward Joe. Yet his engineering credentials appeared repeatedly in projects connected to those acquisitions. Silence. No answer came. Joe never spoke. He didn't need to. William turned toward the guests. "I've known Joe for 14 years. He has never asked me for money. He has never asked me for influence. He has never asked me to protect him." William's voice grew quieter. "When he first brought these documents to me," he paused. "So, he specifically asked me not to accuse anyone." Several people looked toward Joe with surprise. William continued. "He insisted that evidence mattered more than suspicion." Rebecca Lawson had once told Joe that character revealed itself under pressure. Tonight, William was describing exactly that. Evelyn finally spoke. Her voice trembled. Joe. He turned toward her. Why didn't you tell me? Joe answered honestly. Because I didn't know what was true yet. A tear rolled down Evelyn's cheek. And you still came tonight? Joe nodded. It's your birthday. She covered her mouth. For the first time that evening, many guests stopped seeing Joe as the silent husband who had supposedly failed his ambitious wife. They began seeing the man who had quietly carried months of uncertainty without publicly humiliating anyone. William closed the portfolio. I don't intend to resolve this tonight. He looked first at Gabriella, then at Joe. This investigation belongs in the proper legal process. He rested one hand on the folder. Not in a ballroom. The statement carried enormous weight. He was not declaring guilt. He was declaring that the questions had become too serious to ignore. Several guests slowly returned to their seats. No one reached for dessert. No one discussed birthday gifts. The celebration had ended long before. William picked up the flash drive one last time. This evidence will be delivered through the appropriate legal channels. He slipped it back into the portfolio. I've already instructed counsel accordingly. Gabriella stared at her father. You've been investigating me. William answered quietly. I've been investigating the truth. She shook her head. You chose him over your own daughter. William's expression filled with sadness. No. I chose evidence over assumptions. Those words settled over the room with extraordinary force. Joe realized that everything had changed. Not because the investigation was over. It wasn't. Not because anyone had confessed. No one had. Everything had changed because the narrative Gabriella had carefully constructed only minutes earlier had collapsed under the weight of documented facts and measured questions. For months, Joe had feared standing alone. Tonight, he wasn't alone anymore. Not because people suddenly believed him without question, but because they finally understood that the truth deserved to be heard before judgment was passed. As rain continued falling beyond the ballroom windows, William quietly closed the brass clasp on the leather portfolio. The sound echoed through the silent room. To most of the guests, it sounded like the end of an argument. Joe knew better. It was only the beginning of a much larger reckoning. No one moved. The ballroom remained suspended in an uneasy silence that seemed to stretch far beyond a few uncomfortable minutes. Guests who had arrived expecting champagne toasts and birthday speeches now sat staring at untouched dinners that had long since grown cold. The orchestra had quietly packed away their instruments. Even the staff sensed that this was no longer an ordinary private celebration. William Whitmore closed the leather portfolio and placed it beside him. His presentation was finished. He had no intention of saying another word unless someone asked a direct question. Gabriella was the first to break the silence. So that's it? Her voice carried a mixture of disbelief and anger. You embarrass me in front of everyone and call it evidence, William answered evenly. I embarrassed no one. You did. No, he shook his head. You announced your husband's humiliation. I responded after you invited every witness into a private family matter. Several guests lowered their eyes. The statement was impossible to dispute. Gabriella had chosen the audience. William had simply responded to it. She looked toward Joe. Say something. Joe remained calm. I don't think there's anything left for me to add. She laughed bitterly. Convenient. Joe met her eyes. For months I wanted answers. I still do. I don't need an argument tonight. I need the truth. His voice never rose. That calmness unsettled Gabriella more than anger would have. Throughout their marriage, she had always known how to respond when people became emotional. Joe refused to become emotional. Rebecca Lawson quietly stepped beside William. She addressed the room rather than any individual. I represent Joe Ramirez. Several guests recognized her immediately. As legal counsel, I would encourage everyone present not to speculate about criminal liability. She spoke with deliberate precision. An independent investigation has uncovered significant irregularities. Those irregularities require formal review. They do not permit premature conclusions. Joe appreciated every word. Rebecca protected both the evidence and the process. Nothing more, nothing less. One executive slowly stood. His name was Michael Donovan, Chief Financial Officer of Whitmore Commercial Holdings. He looked visibly shaken. William nodded. Go ahead. Michael swallowed. If those financial transfers are authentic, they are certified copies, William answered. Michael continued. Then our auditors need to review every acquisition connected to those entities. Rebecca nodded slightly. That would be a prudent step. Another board member spoke. How many projects are involved? William answered honestly. We don't yet know. The room grew quieter. No one had expected the uncertainty to extend that far. Michael removed his phone. I'm calling the board chairman, Rebecca gently interrupted. I would recommend waiting until tomorrow morning. Michael looked confused. Why? Because tonight you possess incomplete information. She looked around the ballroom. Corporate decisions made during emotional circumstances often create unnecessary complications. Michael slowly lowered the phone. She was right. Across the room, Evelyn remained seated, staring at the birthday cake that no one had cut. The candles had burned themselves into small pools of wax. She whispered almost to herself. I never imagined. Joe walked toward her. He knelt beside her chair. I'm sorry. She looked at him through tear-filled eyes. Why are you apologizing? Because your birthday became this. She reached for his hand. No. Her voice trembled. You tried to prevent it. She looked toward Gabriella. I didn't know. Joe answered quietly. I know. William approached his wife. I'm sorry. Evelyn looked up at him. You investigated our own daughter. William nodded. I investigated documents. She searched his face. Were you hoping to prove Joe innocent? Her voice broke. Or Gabriella innocent, William answered after a long pause. I was hoping the evidence would clear both of them. Those words settled heavily over everyone nearby. It became painfully clear that William had never wanted this outcome. He had hoped for another explanation, a misunderstanding, an accounting mistake, anything else. Instead, every week had produced more unanswered questions. Derek Holloway slowly approached the family. I owe someone an apology. Everyone looked toward him. He faced Joe. When Gabriella announced the divorce, he sighed deeply. I assumed she knew something the rest of us didn't. Joe remained silent. Derek extended his hand. I judged you without asking a single question. Joe shook his hand. I appreciate you saying that. Another guest stepped forward. Then another. Not to declare Joe innocent, not to condemn Gabriella, simply to acknowledge they had accepted one version of events without waiting for evidence. Joe found the moment strangely uncomfortable. He did not want sympathy. He wanted accuracy. Rebecca noticed his expression. She quietly said, This isn't about winning. Joe nodded. I know. It's about correcting assumptions. Exactly. Across the ballroom, Gabriella stood alone. People were no longer avoiding her. They simply didn't know what to say. For years, she had been one of the most admired executives in the company. Confident, brilliant, decisive. Tonight, those qualities were overshadowed by uncertainty. She looked toward her father. So, what happens now? William answered honestly. I don't know. You always know. No. He shook his head. I know how investigations begin. I never know where they end. Michael Donovan approached again. William? Yes. The board will need access to the investigative materials. They'll receive whatever counsel determines is appropriate. Michael nodded. And Joe, William looked toward his son-in-law. I suspect Joe has endured enough for one evening. Rebecca agreed. I'll coordinate future requests. Joe quietly thanked her. He had spent months carrying the weight of the investigation alone. Now professionals were taking responsibility for the process. That brought an unexpected sense of relief. A member of the hotel staff approached cautiously. Mrs. Whitmore, Evelyn looked up. The kitchen asked whether you'd still like dessert served. For a brief moment, no one knew how to answer. Then Evelyn managed a faint smile. Yes. The staff member looked surprised. Really? She nodded. My birthday still happened. A few guests smiled gently. Within minutes, slices of cake began appearing around the room. No one celebrated loudly. No one sang again. Instead, people shared quiet conversations. Some discussed family, others spoke about trust. Several simply sat together in thoughtful silence. Joe accepted a small slice of cake from a waiter. He hadn't realized how hungry he was. Evelyn noticed. You skipped lunch again, didn't you? Joe laughed softly. I guess I did. For 14 years, she said, I've had to remind you to eat. He smiled. Some things don't change. William watched the exchange. It reminded him of countless ordinary family dinners before suspicion and investigations entered their lives. He wondered whether those evenings could ever return. Rebecca checked her watch. It's getting late. Joe nodded. I think it's time to leave. William walked with him toward the entrance. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. Streetlights reflected across the wet pavement. William stopped before Joe reached his car. I owe you something. Joe looked at him. What? My trust? Joe shook his head. You never owed me that. I doubted you. You investigated. There is a difference. William smiled faintly. You're becoming difficult to argue with. Joe smiled back. I learned from a judge. William extended his hand. Instead of shaking it, Joe embraced him. It was brief, quiet. Neither man said another word. As Joe drove away from the country club, he looked once in the rearview mirror. The ballroom lights slowly disappeared into the distance. The public humiliation Gabriella had planned had ended in a way no one could have predicted. But Joe understood something even more important. The evening had not delivered justice. It had delivered opportunity. For the first time in months, the evidence was no longer hidden inside encrypted drives, locked safes, and confidential meetings. The truth had stepped into the open. Now it would have to withstand the scrutiny of investigators, attorneys, regulators, and eventually a courtroom. Joe welcomed that, because unlike accusations, the truth never depended on who spoke the loudest. It depended on what could be proven. No one moved. The ballroom remained suspended in an uneasy silence that seemed to stretch far beyond a few uncomfortable minutes. Guests who had arrived expecting champagne toasts and birthday speeches now sat staring at untouched dinners that had long since grown cold. The orchestra had quietly packed away their instruments. Even the staff sensed that this was no longer an ordinary private celebration. William Whitmore closed the leather portfolio and placed it beside him. His presentation was finished. He had no intention of saying another word unless someone asked a direct question. Gabriella was the first to break the silence. So, that's it. Her voice carried a mixture of disbelief and anger. You embarrass me in front of everyone and call it evidence, William answered evenly. I embarrassed no one. You did. No. He shook his head. You announced your husband's humiliation. I responded after you invited every witness into a private family matter. Several guests lowered their eyes. The statement was impossible to dispute. Gabriella had chosen the audience. William had simply responded to it. She looked toward Joe. Say something. Joe remained calm. I don't think there's anything left for me to add. She laughed bitterly. Convenient? Joe met her eyes. For months I wanted answers. I still do. I don't need an argument tonight. I need the truth. His voice never rose. That calmness unsettled Gabriella more than anger would have. Throughout their marriage, she had always known how to respond when people became emotional. Joe refused to become emotional. Rebecca Lawson quietly stepped beside William. She addressed the room rather than any individual. I represent Joe Ramirez. Several guests recognized her immediately. As legal counsel, I would encourage everyone present not to speculate about criminal liability. She spoke with deliberate precision. An independent investigation has uncovered significant irregularities. Those irregularities require formal review. They do not permit premature conclusions. Joe appreciated every word. Rebecca protected both the evidence and the process. Nothing more, nothing less. One executive slowly stood. His name was Michael Donovan, Chief Financial Officer of Whitmore Commercial Holdings. He looked visibly shaken. William nodded. Go ahead. Michael swallowed. If those financial transfers are authentic, they are certified copies, William answered. Michael continued. Then our auditors need to review every acquisition connected to those entities. Rebecca nodded slightly. That would be a prudent step. Another board member spoke. How many projects are involved? William answered honestly. We don't yet know. The room grew quieter. No one had expected the uncertainty to extend that far. Michael removed his phone. I'm calling the board chairman. Rebecca gently interrupted. I would recommend waiting until tomorrow morning. Michael looked confused. Why? Because tonight you possess incomplete information. She looked around the ballroom. Corporate decisions made during emotional circumstances often create unnecessary complications. Michael slowly lowered the phone. She was right. Across the room, Evelyn remained seated, staring at the birthday cake that no one had cut. The candles had burned themselves into small pools of wax. She whispered almost to herself. I never imagined. Joe walked toward her. He knelt beside her chair. I'm sorry. She looked at him through tear-filled eyes. Why are you apologizing? Because your birthday became this. She reached for his hand. No. Her voice trembled. You tried to prevent it. She looked toward Gabriella. I didn't know. Joe answered quietly. I know. William approached his wife. I'm sorry. Evelyn looked up at him. You investigated our own daughter. William nodded. I investigated documents. She searched his face. Were you hoping to prove Joe innocent? Her voice broke. Or Gabriella innocent, William answered after a long pause. I was hoping the evidence would clear both of them. Those words settled heavily over everyone nearby. It became painfully clear that William had never wanted this outcome. He had hoped for another explanation, a misunderstanding, an accounting mistake, anything else. Instead, every week had produced more unanswered questions. Derek Holloway slowly approached the family. I owe someone an apology. Everyone looked toward him. He faced Joe. When Gabriella announced the divorce, he sighed deeply. I assumed she knew something the rest of us didn't. Joe remained silent. Derek extended his hand. I judged you without asking a single question. Joe shook his hand. I appreciate you saying that. Another guest stepped forward. Then another. Not to declare Joe innocent, not to condemn Gabriella, simply to acknowledge they had accepted one version of events without waiting for evidence. Joe found the moment strangely uncomfortable. He did not want sympathy. He wanted accuracy. Rebecca noticed his expression. She quietly said, "This isn't about winning." Joe nodded. "I know. It's about correcting assumptions." Exactly. Across the ballroom, Gabriella stood alone. People were no longer avoiding her. They simply didn't know what to say. For years, she had been one of the most admired executives in the company. Confident, brilliant, decisive. Tonight, those qualities were overshadowed by uncertainty. She looked toward her father. "So what happens now?" William answered honestly. "I don't know." "You always know." "No." He shook his head. "I know how investigations begin. I never know where they end." Michael Donovan approached again. "William." "Yes." "The board will need access to the investigative materials. They'll receive whatever counsel determines is appropriate." Michael nodded. "And Joe?" William looked toward his son-in-law. "I suspect Joe has endured enough for one evening." Rebecca agreed. "I'll coordinate future requests." Joe quietly thanked her. He had spent months carrying the weight of the investigation alone. Now professionals were taking responsibility for the process. That brought an unexpected sense of relief. A member of the hotel staff approached cautiously. "Mrs. Whitmore?" Evelyn looked up. "The kitchen asked whether you'd still like dessert served." For a brief moment, no one knew how to answer. Then Evelyn managed a faint smile. "Yes." The staff member looked surprised. "Really?" She nodded. "My birthday still happened." A few guests smiled gently. Within minutes, slices of cake began appearing around the room. No one celebrated loudly. No one sang again. Instead, people shared quiet conversations. Some discussed family. Others spoke about trust. Several simply sat together in thoughtful silence. Joe accepted a small slice of cake from a waiter. He hadn't realized how hungry he was. Evelyn noticed. "You skipped lunch again, didn't you?" Joe laughed softly. "I guess I did. For 14 years, she said, I've had to remind you to eat." He smiled. "Some things don't change." William watched the exchange. It reminded him of countless ordinary family dinners before suspicion and investigations entered their lives. He wondered whether those evenings could ever return. Rebecca checked her watch. "It's getting late." Joe nodded. "I think it's time to leave." William walked with him toward the entrance. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. Streetlights reflected across the wet pavement. William stopped before Joe reached his car. "I owe you something." Joe looked at him. "What?" "My trust." Joe shook his head. "You never owed me that." "I doubted you." "You investigated." "There is a difference." William smiled faintly. "You're becoming difficult to argue with." Joe smiled back. "I learned from a judge." William extended his hand. Instead of shaking it, Joe embraced him. It was brief, quiet. Neither man said another word. As Joe drove away from the country club, he looked once in the rearview mirror. The ballroom lights slowly disappeared into the distance. The public humiliation Gabriella had planned had ended in a way no one could have predicted. But Joe understood something even more important. The evening had not delivered justice. It had delivered opportunity. For the first time in months, the evidence was no longer hidden inside encrypted drives, locked safes, and confidential meetings. The truth had stepped into the open. Now it would have to withstand the scrutiny of investigators, attorneys, regulators, and eventually a courtroom. Joe welcomed that. Because unlike accusations, the truth never depended on who spoke the loudest. It depended on what could be proven. 3 months after Evelyn Whitmore's birthday, the first courtroom hearing began on a gray Monday morning in Columbus. Unlike the dramatic trials portrayed on television, there were no overflowing galleries or shouting attorneys. Most of the seats were occupied by lawyers carrying boxes of documents, investigators with laptops, representatives from insurance companies, and a handful of journalists who specialized in corporate litigation. Joe arrived 30 minutes early. Rebecca Lawson believed punctuality communicated confidence. "You never rush into court," she had told him. "You walk in prepared." Joe wore the same charcoal suit he had worn to Evelyn's birthday. Not because it carried sentimental value, because it reminded him of the evening when the truth had finally begun to surface. Rebecca reviewed the day's agenda one final time. "This isn't the trial," Joe nodded. "I know. Today's hearing focuses on document preservation discovery schedules and preliminary motions." She looked directly at him. "Don't expect dramatic testimony." Joe smiled faintly. "I've learned investigations are usually less dramatic than people imagine." "They are." Rebecca gathered her files. "But they're far more important." Across the hallway, another legal team entered the courthouse. Gabriella walked beside Thomas Grayson. She looked composed, though noticeably different from the confident executive who had announced the divorce months earlier. The months following Evelyn's birthday had changed everyone. Whitmore Commercial Holdings had placed several acquisition projects under independent review. Multiple financial institutions had suspended transactions connected to the shell companies. Federal and state regulators had begun requesting records. The investigation had expanded beyond the Whitmore family. Neither Joe nor Gabriella spoke as they passed each other in the hallway. Rebecca acknowledged Thomas with a polite nod. Thomas returned it. Professional courtesy remained intact despite the conflict. Inside courtroom 4B, the judge entered promptly at 9 o'clock. "Good morning." Everyone stood. After the formal introductions, the judge reviewed the growing list of related proceedings: civil fraud allegations, contract disputes, insurance claims, professional licensing concerns, corporate governance issues. The judge looked over the file before him. "This appears to involve multiple overlapping investigations." Rebecca stood. "Yes, Your Honor." Thomas also stood. "We agree." The judge nodded. "Then the court's first priority is preserving evidence." No one objected. The judge continued. "I have reviewed the preliminary submissions." He adjusted his glasses. "I am issuing an immediate preservation order. Every party would be required to maintain emails, financial records, electronic devices, engineering files, accounting systems, and communication logs. Intentional destruction of evidence would carry severe consequences." Joe quietly exhaled. That single order protected months of careful investigative work. Rebecca made a brief note. Thomas did the same. The hearing continued. Corporate attorneys representing Whitmore Commercial Holdings confirmed that outside forensic auditors had already secured company servers. Representatives from 2 financial institutions acknowledged freezing records connected to several disputed accounts. The judge approved coordinated discovery deadlines. Everything moved efficiently, methodically, exactly as Rebecca had predicted. After a short recess, the judge addressed Joe directly. "Mr. Ramirez." Joe stood. "Yes, Your Honor. I understand your engineering license became part of this dispute." "Yes." "Has any licensing board suspended your credentials?" "No, Your Honor." Rebecca handed the clerk certified documentation. "The Ohio Licensing Board has reviewed preliminary evidence and determined there is currently insufficient basis for administrative suspension." The judge reviewed the document. "Very well." Joe felt an enormous weight lift from his shoulders. For months he had feared losing the career he had spent nearly 2 decades building. Now the licensing board had at least recognized that serious questions remained unanswered. The judge turned toward Rebecca. "Your client voluntarily preserved extensive records." "He did." "Before receiving notice of litigation." "Yes." Thomas stood. "We acknowledge that point, Your Honor." Joe glanced briefly toward Gabriella. She remained expressionless. The judge looked toward Thomas. Counsel, does your client dispute that the engineering records require further forensic examination? Thomas answered carefully. No, Your Honor. We believe additional expert analysis is appropriate. Rebecca appreciated the response. There was no unnecessary argument, only recognition that technical evidence required technical evaluation. The remainder of the morning focused on scheduling, expert witness disclosures, electronic discovery procedures, confidentiality agreements, production deadlines, no dramatic accusations, no emotional confrontations, just the slow machinery of the legal system beginning its work. When court recessed for lunch, reporters gathered outside. Microphones immediately appeared. Rebecca quietly positioned herself beside Joe. No comments. One reporter persisted. Mr. Ramirez, do you believe your wife framed you? Rebecca answered before Joe could speak. The evidence will be presented in court. Another reporter turned toward Gabriella. Ms. Whitmore, did you knowingly authorize fraudulent transactions? Thomas responded calmly. My client denies any intentional wrongdoing. Within minutes, both legal teams had left the courthouse. Rebecca and Joe walked to a nearby cafe. Only after they were seated did Joe finally speak. That felt ordinary. Rebecca smiled. Most court proceedings are. I expected more confrontation. Real litigation isn't about dramatic speeches. She stirred her coffee. It's about documents, timelines, expert testimony, and credibility. Joe nodded thoughtfully. I suppose that's reassuring. It should be. Later that afternoon, William arrived at Rebecca's office. He had attended the hearing from the public gallery without speaking to either side. Rebecca invited him inside. How are you holding up? William smiled wearily. I spent decades sitting on the bench. It's strange sitting in the audience. Joe offered him a chair. William accepted. I've been thinking. Joe waited. I owe you another apology. Joe sighed softly. We've already discussed that. I know. William folded his hands. But today I watched opposing counsel acknowledge your preservation of evidence. He looked directly at Joe. You never tried to hide. You never destroyed documents. You never retaliated. His voice became quieter. That's what innocent people often do. Joe shook his head. I just followed Rebecca's advice. Rebecca laughed gently. You also had the discipline to follow it. Many clients didn't. They panicked, deleted emails, replaced phones, destroyed notebooks. Joe had done none of those things. Every document he had preserved now strengthened his credibility. That evening, independent forensic accountants delivered another preliminary report to both legal teams. The analysis traced additional financial transfers among the shell companies. More importantly, it identified several transactions that had bypassed ordinary internal approval procedures. Rebecca reviewed the report late into the evening. She underlined several paragraphs before calling Joe. We've made progress. What kind? The accountants found approval chains that don't match company policy. Joe remained silent. Rebecca continued. They're not drawing conclusions, but they've identified inconsistencies that require explanation. Joe understood immediately. Another piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. Not proof of guilt, not proof of innocence. Simply another verified fact. Exactly the kind of evidence that William had always trusted. As night settled over Columbus, Joe returned to the small home he had rented after moving out. The house felt quiet, almost unfamiliar. He unpacked his briefcase and placed the day's court filings into a fireproof cabinet. Old habits remained. Document everything. Protect everything. Assume every record might someday matter. Before going to bed, he opened a small notebook. On the final page, he wrote only one sentence. The truth no longer belongs to me alone. He closed the notebook. Months earlier, he had carried the investigation almost entirely by himself. Now, judges, attorneys, accountants, engineers, forensic specialists, regulators, and corporate auditors all examined the same evidence independently. Whatever the final outcome might be, it would not depend upon rumor. It would depend upon facts that could withstand scrutiny. For the first time since discovering the forged engineering approvals, Joe slept through the entire night without waking once. The long legal battle was far from over. But he no longer felt as though he was fighting it alone. 6 months after the first courtroom hearing, the legal landscape looked entirely different. What had begun as a dispute surrounding a single marriage had expanded into one of the largest corporate compliance investigations Whitmore Commercial Holdings had ever experienced. Independent auditors had completed thousands of hours of financial review. Digital forensic specialists had reconstructed deleted communication logs. Engineering experts had compared every questioned approval with Joe Ramirez's authenticated work history. The investigation no longer depended on assumptions. It depended on measurable evidence. Joe arrived at Rebecca Lawson's office on a crisp autumn morning carrying nothing but a notebook. Months earlier, he would have arrived with boxes of documents. Now nearly every piece of evidence had been cataloged, indexed, and entered into discovery. Rebecca greeted him with an unusual smile. "I have good news." Joe raised an eyebrow. "That's becoming a pleasant habit?" She handed him a certified letter. "The Ohio Engineering Licensing Board has officially closed its administrative inquiry." Joe carefully unfolded the document. The conclusion was brief. After reviewing expert testimony, authentication records, and forensic evidence, the board found no basis to discipline or suspend Joe Ramirez's engineering license. His professional standing remained unchanged. Joe read the final sentence twice. For nearly a year, he had worried that decades of honest work might disappear because someone had used his professional credentials without permission. Now the licensing authority itself had confirmed what he had maintained from the beginning. Rebecca watched quietly. "How does it feel?" Joe folded the letter carefully. "It feels like I can finally breathe." She nodded. "I thought it might." Later that afternoon, Joe visited the engineering firm where he had continued working throughout the investigation. Several coworkers noticed the certified envelope in his hand. His department manager, Daniel Pierce, invited him into his office. "I heard from legal." Joe smiled. "So, you already know?" Daniel stood and extended his hand. "Congratulations." Joe shook it. "Thank you." Daniel leaned against his desk. "I owe you an apology." Joe looked surprised. "For what?" "When this investigation first surfaced." Daniel hesitated. "I never accused you. But I wondered." Joe appreciated the honesty. "I probably would have wondered too." Daniel shook his head. "No. I should have trusted the man I'd worked beside for 12 years. Joe smiled gently. "You trusted the process. And the process worked." Daniel laughed quietly. "You've become wiser through all of this. I'm just more patient." Word spread quickly through the office. Not because Joe celebrated. He didn't. Others simply respected the official findings. Several younger engineers approached him throughout the day. One asked, "How did you stay calm?" Joe considered the question carefully. "I wasn't always calm." The young engineer looked surprised. "You seemed calm." Joe smiled. "There's a difference," he continued. "I worried. I got angry. I lost sleep. But I never allowed those emotions to decide what I documented." The engineer nodded thoughtfully. That conversation remained with Joe long after the workday ended. He realized patience was often misunderstood. People imagined patience meant feeling no frustration. Instead, it meant refusing to let frustration control decisions. Meanwhile, Whitmore Commercial Holdings continued implementing major internal reforms. The board of directors approved new compliance procedures, Engineering approvals required additional independent verification. Executive access to technical authorization systems became heavily restricted. Outside audits became mandatory for major acquisitions. Michael Donovan personally oversaw many of the changes. During one board meeting, he addressed the directors. "We focused for years on efficiency." He paused. "We should have invested equally in accountability." No one disagreed. The lessons had come at enormous financial and personal cost. William Whitmore attended several meetings as an advisor rather than a decision-maker. His retirement remained unchanged. He had no desire to return to corporate leadership. Instead, he encouraged transparency. At one meeting, he offered a simple observation. "Organizations rarely fail because people stop working hard." He looked around the room. "They fail because honest questions stop being welcomed." Silence followed. Every director understood exactly what he meant. Months earlier, several employees had noticed irregularities. Most assumed someone else had already verified them. That assumption had nearly allowed the scheme to continue indefinitely. One Saturday afternoon, William invited Joe to lunch. Not to discuss court, not to discuss evidence. Simply lunch. They met at a small neighborhood restaurant they had visited years before. The waitress recognized William immediately. "The usual," he smiled. "For both of us." Joe laughed. "You ordered for me." William nodded. "You've been eating the same grilled chicken sandwich for 14 years. Joe admitted he was right. As they waited for their meal, the conversation drifted away from litigation. Construction projects, football, books, family memories. Eventually, William became quiet. "I've missed this." Joe understood. "So have I." William looked out the window. "I spent months speaking to you as an investigator." He turned back. "I forgot how much I enjoyed speaking to you as family." Joe smiled warmly. "That never changed for me." William lowered his eyes briefly. "I know." After lunch, they walked slowly through a nearby park. Children played beneath colorful autumn trees. Families gathered around picnic tables. Life continued as though none of the courtroom battles existed. William finally asked the question he had avoided for months. "What happens after all of this ends?" Joe thought for several moments. "I keep building." William looked puzzled. "Buildings?" Joe laughed. "Those too. But also my life. I can't spend the rest of it reliving what happened." William nodded approvingly. "Good. Holding on to anger is another way of allowing the past to control the future." Joe recognized the lesson immediately. It sounded exactly like something William would have said years earlier. Later that evening, Joe returned home and opened a storage cabinet containing dozens of investigation binders. He looked at them for several minutes. For nearly a year, those binders had represented survival. Every page, every receipt, every timeline, every preserved email. They had protected his reputation. Now they represented something different. Proof that truth required persistence. Not luck. He closed the cabinet. Across town, Gabriella continued preparing for the remaining legal proceedings. Her attorneys challenged portions of the financial analysis. Rebecca responded with additional expert reports. The litigation remained active. Nothing had been finally resolved. Yet one important difference had emerged. The central question was no longer whether Joe had participated in wrongdoing. That question had largely disappeared. The focus had shifted toward identifying who had authorized specific decisions and why established safeguards had failed. For Joe, that change mattered deeply. His identity was no longer defined by suspicion. It was defined by integrity. On the anniversary of Evelyn's birthday, the Whitmore family gathered again. This time the celebration took place quietly at William and Evelyn's home. No ballroom, no corporate executives, no formal speeches. Only immediate family and a few lifelong friends. Evelyn baked the birthday cake herself. As everyone gathered around the dining table, she smiled gently. I have only one birthday wish. Everyone looked toward her. I hope this family never waits for a crisis before choosing honesty. No one applauded, no one joked. They simply nodded. Joe looked around the table. The wounds had not completely healed. Perhaps some never would. Trust required much longer to rebuild than to destroy. But for the first time in a very long while, the family shared a meal without secrets hidden beneath polite conversation. Joe realized that patience had given him something more valuable than vindication. It had given him the opportunity to let truth emerge without sacrificing the principles that had guided him his entire life. And in the end, preserving those principles proved far more important than winning any single legal argument. Nearly 18 months after Evelyn Whitmore's birthday, the final phase of the litigation approached. Most of the dramatic moments had already passed. There were no surprise witnesses waiting in hallways, no last-minute confessions, no shocking evidence hidden until the final hour. Instead, there were thousands of pages of verified records, months of expert testimony, and a legal process that had carefully separated fact from speculation. Rebecca Lawson often reminded Joe that justice rarely arrived in a dramatic moment. It usually arrives one document at a time. Joe had come to appreciate that truth. On the morning of the final evidentiary hearing, the courthouse felt strangely familiar. The security officers recognized many of the attorneys. Court clerks greeted Rebecca by name. Even Joe no longer felt intimidated by the building. He understood its purpose now. It was not designed to produce excitement. It existed to evaluate evidence. Rebecca organized the final exhibits before court began. Engineering authentication reports, digital forensic analyses, financial tracing summaries, corporate governance reviews, independent accounting opinions. Every exhibit had been reviewed repeatedly by both sides. There were very few surprises left. When the judge entered, everyone stood. After preliminary matters concluded, the court heard closing presentations regarding the disputed engineering approvals. Rebecca rose first. She spoke without raising her voice. This case began with an assumption. She paused. When unauthorized engineering approvals appeared, suspicion naturally fell upon the licensed engineer whose seal appeared on the documents. She looked briefly toward Joe. That assumption was understandable. She turned back toward the bench. But assumptions are not evidence. She carefully summarized the expert findings. Independent forensic specialists established that the questioned approvals originated from executive conference room terminals rather than Joe's assigned workstation. Metadata demonstrated that several approvals were created, while Joe was physically documented at construction sites, professional conferences, or family events. Engineering experts testified that the signatures displayed characteristics of reproduction rather than naturally executed originals. Financial investigators independently connected the disputed projects to shell entities whose corporate structures bypassed normal compliance procedures, Rebecca concluded simply. The evidence consistently excludes Mr. Ramirez as the source of the unauthorized engineering approvals. She returned to counsel table. Thomas Grayson then addressed the court. His presentation differed in one important respect. He did not attempt to argue that Joe had forged his own approvals. Instead, he focused on disputed questions regarding corporate responsibility, internal oversight, and individual decision-making. Joe respected that approach. The litigation had evolved. No longer was his integrity the central issue. The remaining disputes concerned who had authorized specific corporate actions and whether legal duties had been breached. The judge listened carefully throughout both presentations. When questioning began, the court-appointed digital forensic expert returned to the witness stand. Based upon your analysis, the judge asked, did you identify evidence that Mr. Ramirez personally created the questioned engineering approvals? No, Your Honor. Did your examination identify evidence that his professional credentials were used without normal authentication procedures? Yes. The expert explained the technical findings once again. Server access logs, authentication records, time synchronization, digital metadata. Everything pointed toward unauthorized use of Joe's professional identity. The judge thanked the witness. Next came the independent engineering expert. He had reviewed hundreds of authenticated signatures from Joe's career. He displayed enlarged comparisons showing natural writing rhythm beside the questioned signatures. He explained how copied signatures often reproduced appearance while failing to reproduce movement. After nearly an hour of testimony, his conclusion remained unchanged. In my professional opinion, the questioned signatures were not naturally executed by Mr. Ramirez. Rebecca had no further questions. Neither did Thomas. The courtroom grew quiet. Finally, the judge addressed Joe directly. Mr. Ramirez. Joe stood. Yes, Your Honor. You preserved evidence before litigation began. Yes. You cooperated throughout every investigation. Yes. You voluntarily produced records that could be independently verified. Yes. The judge nodded. The court has taken notice of that conduct. Joe simply replied, Thank you, Your Honor. After a brief recess, the judge returned to deliver several rulings addressing the engineering issues. The courtroom became completely silent. The evidence presented regarding Mr. Ramirez's professional conduct has been extensive. The judge reviewed several written findings. The court finds that the authenticated engineering records, independent forensic examinations, and corroborating documentation consistently support the conclusion that Mr. Ramirez did not personally authorize the questioned engineering approvals. Joe felt Rebecca gently squeeze his arm. The judge continued. The court further finds that significant unauthorized use of Mr. Ramirez's professional credentials occurred. No celebration followed. Courtrooms were not places for applause. Instead, attorneys quietly made notes while the clerk recorded the rulings. The judge looked toward Joe once more. Mr. Ramirez. Yes, Your Honor. Your professional reputation became entangled in matters not of your own making. The judge paused briefly. The evidence demonstrates that your response was one of preservation, cooperation, and transparency. Those actions substantially assisted the court in reaching today's findings. Joe nodded respectfully. Thank you, Your Honor. Several remaining issues involving corporate liability and financial responsibility would continue under separate proceedings. But for Joe personally, the most important question had now been answered. His integrity had been affirmed through evidence rather than sympathy. Outside the courthouse, reporters again gathered near the front steps. This time, Rebecca allowed Joe to make a brief statement. He stepped toward the microphones. I'd like to thank the investigators, engineers, accountants, attorneys, and the court for allowing the evidence to speak. He paused. I also hope people remember something important. He looked across the crowd. When accusations are made, they can spread in a single afternoon. He smiled faintly. But proving the truth often takes months. He thanked everyone and stepped away without answering additional questions. William and Evelyn were waiting nearby. William extended his hand. Joe accepted it. Then William pulled him into a brief embrace. I couldn't be prouder. Joe smiled. You taught me to trust evidence. William shook his head. No. You chose to live by it. Evelyn wiped away tears. I finally feel like I can breathe again. Joe hugged her gently. So can I. That evening, Joe returned to the engineering firm. He wasn't required to. No meetings had been scheduled. He simply wanted to walk through the building where he had spent so much of his professional life. Daniel Pierce noticed him entering. I thought you'd take the day off. Joe smiled. I wanted to come back. Daniel looked around the office. You know, he laughed softly. Nothing changed while you were gone. Joe looked across the drafting room. Engineers still debated beam sizes. Project managers still argued over deadlines. Phones still rang. Construction schedules still filled whiteboards. Ordinary life had continued. For some reason, Joe found that comforting. His career had survived. His reputation had survived. Most importantly, the values that had guided him from the beginning had survived. As he unlocked his office, he noticed the small, framed engineering license hanging on the wall. Months earlier, he had wondered whether he would be forced to remove it forever. Now it remained exactly where it belonged. Not because someone had defended him with passionate speeches, because careful documentation, honest investigation, and patient perseverance had allowed the truth to emerge. Joe smiled quietly before switching on the office lights. Tomorrow there would be new projects, new calculations, and new buildings waiting to be designed. For the first time in a long while, he looked forward to all of them. 1 year after the court recognized that Joe Ramirez had not authorized the forged engineering approvals, life had settled into a rhythm that once seemed impossible. The headlines disappeared. Television reporters moved on to other stories. Corporate investigations reached their final administrative stages. Most people in Columbus stopped talking about the Whitmore case. For Joe, that was one of the greatest gifts imaginable. He had never wanted to become known for a lawsuit. He wanted to be known for the buildings he designed. On a bright spring morning, Joe stood on the roof of a newly completed community center overlooking the Scioto River. Children played in the park below while city inspectors completed their final walkthrough inside the building. Daniel Pierce joined him near the rooftop mechanical equipment. "Looks good." Joe smiled. "It finally does." Daniel laughed. "You've said that about every project for the last 15 years. Because every project can always improve." The city inspector approached carrying a clipboard. "Mr. Ramirez." "Yes." "I've completed the structural review." Joe waited. The inspector smiled. "Everything meets or exceeds requirements." Joe thanked him. The words sounded ordinary, yet they carried extraordinary meaning. For months, Joe had lived with the fear that every engineering decision he had ever made might be questioned. Now his work once again spoke for itself. As the inspector walked away, Daniel looked toward Joe. "You know what I admire most?" Joe shrugged. "My designs—" Daniel shook his head. "No. You never allowed what happened to make you careless." Joe looked surprised. "I've seen people become cynical after much less." He gestured toward the completed building. "You became even more thorough." Joe considered the observation. Perhaps Daniel was right. Every calculation now received one additional review. Every approval required one additional verification. Not because Joe distrusted himself, because experience had taught him that protecting the truth required discipline. Several weeks later, Whitmore Commercial Holdings held its annual shareholder meeting. For the first time in company history, a substantial portion of the presentation focused on ethics, governance, and compliance reforms rather than financial performance. Michael Donovan stood before the shareholders. "The past 2 years challenged this organization in ways we never anticipated." He paused. "We made costly mistakes. We relied too heavily on assumptions. We failed to question irregularities soon enough." A large screen displayed the company's new oversight procedures: independent audit committees, enhanced cybersecurity, mandatory approval verification, anonymous reporting channels, annual ethics training for every executive. Michael continued, "Strong companies are not defined by never making mistakes. They are defined by how honestly they respond when mistakes are discovered." William Whitmore watched quietly from the audience. He no longer served as an executive. He had attended only because the board requested his presence. After the meeting ended, several younger managers approached him. One asked, "Judge Whitmore, how do we prevent something like this from happening again?" William smiled thoughtfully. "You probably can't prevent every dishonest act." The manager looked disappointed. "But you can create a culture where honest people are never afraid to ask difficult questions." He paused. "And when someone does ask those questions," he looked around the room, "listen before you judge." The young managers thanked him. William hoped they would remember those words long after the meeting ended. Meanwhile, Joe found unexpected satisfaction outside of work. He began volunteering one Saturday each month at a local engineering outreach program for high school students. Many of the students came from neighborhoods where few adults worked in technical professions. Joe enjoyed answering their questions. One afternoon, a teenager asked, "What makes someone a good engineer?" Joe smiled. "Curiosity." The student looked confused. "Not math." Joe laughed. "Math matters. So does physics. But curiosity comes first." He pointed toward a bridge visible through the classroom window. "Every safe bridge exists because someone kept asking whether it was strong enough." Another student raised her hand. "What about honesty?" Joe nodded. "Without honesty, engineering doesn't work. If an engineer lies about the numbers..." He let the sentence remain unfinished. The students understood. Several weeks later, Rebecca Lawson invited Joe to lunch. Neither of them carried legal files. Neither mentioned court for nearly an hour. Finally, Rebecca smiled. "I have something." She reached into her briefcase and handed Joe a thin folder. Inside was the final notice closing the remaining civil matters directly involving him. Every personal claim against Joe had been resolved. No further proceedings required his participation. Joe looked at the last page for several moments. "So," Rebecca smiled. "So you're officially finished." Joe closed the folder carefully. "I don't think I realized how much I needed to hear that." Rebecca laughed softly. "Most clients don't." They walked outside together. Before leaving, Rebecca said, "I've represented many people." Joe looked at her. "Some were innocent. Some weren't." She smiled warmly, but very few had the patience to let the evidence work. Joe thanked her sincerely. "I couldn't have done it without you." She shook her head. "You still had to make the difficult decisions." One Sunday afternoon, William and Evelyn invited Joe to their home for dinner. Only family attended. No attorneys, no investigators, no executives. The dining room looked almost exactly as it had years earlier. Evelyn served her famous roast chicken. William complained jokingly that she had once again made too much mashed potatoes. Everyone laughed. For a moment it felt as though the difficult years had become a distant memory. After dinner, they gathered on the back porch. The sun slowly disappeared behind the trees. William handed Joe a small wrapped package. "What's this?" "A late gift." Joe opened it carefully. Inside rested an antique fountain pen in a polished wooden case. He looked at William. "This is the pen you always kept in your study." William nodded. "I signed hundreds of judicial opinions with it." Joe held it gently. "I can't accept this." "I insist." William smiled. "I've retired. The pen deserves someone who still signs important documents." Joe looked at the engraved initials. "W.W." William chuckled. "You've earned it." Joe became quiet. "I don't know what to say." William placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then don't. Just promise me one thing." "What?" "Keep signing your own name." Joe immediately understood. Not merely on engineering plans, on every decision in life, with integrity that no one else could imitate or steal. "I promise." As evening settled over Columbus, Joe drove home with the fountain pen resting safely beside him. He no longer thought about revenge. He no longer replayed the humiliation of that birthday party. Those memories had lost their power. They had been replaced by something stronger, a renewed appreciation for quiet integrity, patient persistence, and the people who had chosen truth, even when it came at great personal cost. Looking ahead, Joe realized his future would never be defined by the worst chapter of his life. Instead, it would be defined by everything he chose to build after surviving it, and that he believed was the greatest victory of all. 2 years after Evelyn Whitmore's birthday, very few people remembered the details that had once dominated conversations across boardrooms and courtrooms. Construction cranes continued rising above the Columbus skyline. New businesses opened. Families celebrated birthdays. Life moved forward. Joe Ramirez often thought about how quietly the world continued after events that once seemed impossible to survive. On a cool Saturday morning, he stood beside another completed project. It was not the tallest building he had designed, nor the most expensive. It was a public library built to serve several growing neighborhoods. Children ran through the front entrance carrying stacks of books, while parents admired the bright, open reading spaces. The mayor shook Joe's hand during the dedication ceremony. "Beautiful work." Joe smiled. "Thank you. We're proud to have it." As photographers took pictures, Joe found himself looking less at the cameras and more at the people already enjoying the building. That had always been the purpose. Buildings were never truly about concrete or steel. They were about the lives lived inside them. After the ceremony, a young engineer approached. "Mr. Ramirez." "Yes." "I just wanted to tell you something." Joe waited. "When everything happened," the young man hesitated, "I was still in college. I followed the news." Joe nodded politely. "I almost changed majors." Joe looked surprised. "Why?" "I thought one accusation could destroy an entire career forever." Joe remained silent. The engineer smiled. "But then I watched what happened. You didn't quit. You didn't attack anyone. You just kept telling the truth." He looked toward the library. "That's one of the reasons I became an engineer." Joe felt genuinely humbled. "Thank you. I hope you're an even better engineer than I am." The young man laughed. "I'll try." As he walked away, Joe realized that influence often appeared in unexpected ways. Sometimes people learned more from watching someone endure hardship than from watching someone achieve success. That evening, Joe visited William and Evelyn. The familiar house felt warm and peaceful. The roses Evelyn had cared for during so many difficult years bloomed beautifully along the backyard fence. William poured coffee while Joe helped set the table. Old habits had returned naturally. "So," William asked with a smile, "how many times did you inspect that library before approving it?" Joe laughed. "More than necessary." William raised an eyebrow. "I doubt that." Evelyn carried dessert into the dining room. "I know exactly how many." Both men looked at her. 7. Joe looked embarrassed. "You counted." "I watched." She smiled warmly. "You've always believed that people deserve your very best work." Dinner passed with easy conversation. No one mentioned lawsuits, no one discussed investigations, no one brought up shell companies or forged documents. Those subjects no longer defined the family. Later, as the evening grew quiet, William invited Joe into his study. The leather portfolio still rested on the bookshelf. Joe noticed it immediately. "You kept it." William nodded. "I did." He removed it carefully and placed it on the desk. "For a long time, I thought about throwing it away." Joe looked at the worn leather. "What changed your mind?" William rested one hand on the cover. "It reminds me that evidence matters." He smiled gently. "But it also reminds me that families must never stop telling each other the truth." Joe understood. The portfolio no longer represented betrayal. It represented a lesson. William opened one drawer and removed a folded sheet of paper. "I wrote something." Joe accepted it. It contained only a few sentences. Character is revealed long before judgment is announced. The courtroom merely gives everyone else the opportunity to see it. Joe read the words twice. "I like that." William chuckled. "I spent weeks trying to make it shorter." "You succeeded." Joe carefully folded the paper and placed it inside the wooden case containing the antique fountain pen William had given him months earlier. The two belonged together. One represented responsibility. The other represented integrity. As Joe prepared to leave, Evelyn embraced him. I'm proud of you. He smiled. I couldn't have done it alone. She shook her head. Maybe not. But you chose the difficult path every single time. Driving home through the quiet streets of Columbus, Joe reflected on everything that had happened since that unforgettable birthday. He had been publicly humiliated. His reputation had been questioned. His career had nearly been destroyed. His marriage had ended. None of those experiences had been easy. None of them had been fair. Yet looking back, he realized something unexpected. The greatest victory had never been winning in court. It had never been proving someone else wrong. It had never been seeing investigations confirm what he already knew. His greatest victory was that he had refused to become someone he would not recognize. He had refused to answer humiliation with humiliation. He had refused to replace evidence with anger. He had refused to sacrifice integrity simply because doing so might have been easier. Those choices had protected far more than his engineering license. They had protected the person he wanted to remain for the rest of his life. Several days later, Joe returned to the library shortly before sunset. The building had already become part of the community. Students studied quietly. Retirees read newspapers by the large windows. Parents helped young children choose their first books. No one recognized him. No one knew he had designed the structure. Joe preferred it that way. He walked slowly through the main reading room before stepping outside. The evening sunlight reflected from the glass entrance exactly as he had imagined during the earliest design sketches. He smiled. Some things took years to build. Trust, justice, a meaningful career, a good name. None of them appeared overnight. All required patience. As Joe walked toward his truck, he thought about one final lesson. Steel becomes stronger only after passing through intense pressure. Perhaps people do as well. He started the engine and drove toward home, grateful not for the hardships themselves, but for the quiet strength they had revealed along the way. If anyone had asked him what ultimately defeated deception, he would not have answered with lawsuits, investigations, or courtroom rulings. He would have answered with something much simpler: patience, integrity, and the courage to let the truth arrive in its own time. Every life will eventually face a moment when appearances seem stronger than the truth. You may be misunderstood, falsely accused, betrayed by someone you trusted or judged before anyone takes the time to hear your side. In those moments, it is tempting to fight anger with anger or to seek revenge as quickly as possible. But this story reminds us that real strength is not measured by how loudly we defend ourselves. It is measured by how faithfully we hold on to our integrity when no one else seems to believe in us. Joe's greatest victory was never the courtroom ruling or the restoration of his reputation. His greatest victory was that he refused to let betrayal change the kind of person he was. He chose patience over panic evidence, over emotion, and character over revenge. In the end, the truth did not need to shout. It simply needed time. Lies may travel fast, but truth has a remarkable way of catching up when it is supported by honesty, courage, and perseverance. If this story touched your heart, let it be a reminder that your character is your greatest asset. Protect it even when no one is watching. Keep doing what is right, even when it feels unfair. The people who matter will eventually see the difference between accusations and truth. If you enjoyed this story, please share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever experienced a time when patience and integrity helped you overcome injustice? We'd love to hear your story. And if you enjoy meaningful stories about resilience, justice, and the strength of the human spirit, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next inspiring story. Thank you for watching.